What I'd like to do is take this time and really honor the work that the two of you have done, and also many of you here in the Hub for Humanity are really involved in trying to bring peace and justice into the world. You know, these statistics that Sander started with about the high percentage of serious challenges that happen with humanitarian aid workers is very important to recognize. And sadly, those are statistics that are shared, even in the United States at least, by physicians and veterinarians. That when you care for others, you're really, especially not when you're not given the tools of resilience, you're really at risk of developing depression, anxiety, a sense of isolation, feeling of helplessness, and even suicidality. So we want to recognize that whether it's someone caring for others in humanitarian aid work or in the medical profession, what's so important for this HagueTalks offering is to say that anyone caring for another should be given the tools of developing resilience. But at least in the area that I've heard about humanitarian aid workers training, that's not offered. It's certainly not offered in the area of medical training, or whether it's human medicine or animal medicine. And so what you see is that when you put yourself into a situation of caring for someone, there are some fundamental challenges. So I want to build on that last question that was raised about sympathy versus empathy and bring in yet another term that you may have heard, which is compassion, and then talk about something that will be the underlying approach we take to thinking about building resilience, which is what you do with consciousness. So for example, at the Garrison Institute, there is a belief that combining three things into one effort will actually be helpful to support the world, especially how we are now in the 21st century. Those three things are inner practice, to develop an inner way of cultivating your consciousness, that we'll talk about soon. Science, and that's what I'll be reviewing with you now, and outer action, wise action to try to help, for example, people in need of humanitarian aid, or someone who's ill, or a planet called Earth that is in a crisis. And so climate crisis, humanitarian aid, and medical care all involve this process by which a person is saying, I'm going to try to recognize the suffering that's going on and do something about it. So with the word sympathy that was asked about, it's interesting. Some people would see the word sympathy as, you know, I'm feeling so distant from you and that I just realize you're in pain and I have sympathy for you. Empathy has 5 components that are often not recognized that's a little bit more broader than sympathy, and they include, number 1, emotional resonance. Now, emotional resonance means if you're in front of me and I'm going to be empathically resonating with you, I'm going to feel your feelings. Now, when you look at the way the brain works, there are 2 ways you can do that. You can over-identify with the person, in which case you lose the differentiation between you and them, and emotional resonance can absolutely lead to burnout because you're over-identifying with that person without maintaining the distinctions. However, emotional resonance doesn't need to lead to burnout. You can just feel another person's feelings and maintain a differentiated nature. Let me give you an example. You put a person in a brain scanner and you show them photographs. And here are the 2 conditions that you'll have as an example. In one condition, you're showing a photograph of a terrible, terrible car accident. And the subject in the brain scanner is told, imagine if that were you. That's condition number 1. Condition number 2, same photograph, different subject. They say, imagine what it's like to be that person who was in that car accident. Both of those are examples of empathy. One is over-identifying, saying, oh, if that were me, this is how it would feel for me. Now, that's one way of doing it, but you can be more effectively empathic by saying, I wonder what that person feels, and still feel their feelings. So this is where emotional resonance If it's over-identification, absolutely, like you asked about, can lead to burnout. But emotional resonance is actually really important to sense another person's suffering. The second thing is called empathic understanding, where you really say, if that person went through this thing and that thing and this thing, then I can intellectually consider that what their mind is going through is this, that, and this. And that's a very important part of empathy, to understand the mind of another. In our institute, we call that mind sight. You're actually seeing the mind of another person with empathic understanding, much more than what sympathy does, because now you're really understanding the other person, and they begin to feel felt by you, which if you work on a suicide prevention service, that's what the suicide person needs to feel, is that you really understand them. Not that you're just sympathetic, but that you actually are being felt by the other person. The third kind of empathy is where you take that empathic resonance you can have, that empathic understanding, and then what you're developing now is this capacity to put yourself in the perspective of the other person. Our brain is capable of altering perspective. So I can look at you there and say, I wonder what it would be like to sit in that chair looking at me up there. And we can do that. It's absolutely amazing. It's called perspective taking. And that's another reason empathy is so important for anyone who's caring for anyone. A fourth kind of empathy is rarely talked about. It's called empathic joy, where you feel really excited about another person's success. You're happy when they're happy. Something very underdeveloped in the modern world. The fifth aspect of empathy is called empathic concern, which means when I see that you're actually suffering, I open a window of care where I said, I'd like to reduce that suffering. And that brings us to compassion. Compassion is often defined by people like Paul Gilbert as sensing the suffering of another person, and that requires empathy, by the way. And then imagining in your mind, what can I do to reduce the suffering, and then doing something. So compassion builds on empathy. They're not separate from each other. For 98% of people on the planet, you don't have any compassion if you don't have empathy. And so we want to make sure not to throw empathy out. What we want to do, and now we'll come to an exercise we'll do, is do a practice whereby you become aware of your inner state, and then you do something with your inner state so you don't over-identify with the person in front of you, where you maintain empathic connection without burning out by over-identifying. So an aid worker learning this, or a physician learning this, can learn a different way of approaching things. I'm going to do a very brief exercise to give you an experience of what might be happening in humanitarian aid workers, for them to really become aware of this, and you can feel it directly. What I'm going to do is very briefly say a word, and I'm going to repeat it several times. And all I'm going to ask you to do is to just become aware of your internal feeling. That's it. Because if you're not aware of your internal feeling, no matter what you're doing, humanitarian aid worker or something else, you don't know how to modify it if you can't monitor it. So this is really an exercise in monitoring. But then I'm going to say another word, and that'll teach you an aspect of how to modify what you're feeling. Are you ready? Okay, so sit up straight. Take a nice deep breath. If you're out in virtual world, same thing. Here we go. No. 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 Yes. 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 Try taking a nice deep breath. And put one hand on your chest and one hand on your abdomen. And put some gentle pressure as you take some nice deep breaths again. And now try reversing it, so the hand on your chest goes to your belly, the one on your belly goes to your chest. Nice deep breaths. And now put it whichever way is most comforting for you. Hand on chest, hand on belly, whichever one is, put it the way it feels most comforting, and just sense your breath in and out. And just for a quick review before I stop, how many of you felt, you can put your hands down there or leave them there if you'd like, how many of you felt the difference between no and yes? Raise your hand. And just throw out some words. What did no feel like? Disgust? Shocking? You did something wrong? Rejection? Anger? Fear? Tension? And this no state is what humanitarian aid workers feel. Am I right? And if this is overwhelming you all the time, you feel helpless and you have those feelings, it's the 4 F's of the brain when you're threatened: fighting, fleeing, freezing, or fainting. And if the brain is sustaining that threat state over time and doesn't learn to create a yes state, and throw out some words of what yes felt like. Calm, relaxing, satisfying, acceptance, right? That's what we want to help humanitarian aid workers and any care provider to move from this threat state of the no brain to the relaxing, receptive state of the yes brain. These techniques are available. And to put someone in humanitarian aid work without these techniques is no longer needed. To put someone in the medical profession without these inner techniques that can help you move from a no-brain state that can lead in sustained ways to depression, anxiety, and suicide doesn't make any sense. And so what we have as an opportunity, just to give you an example, is if you learn a reflective practice of focusing on your breath, in and out, even just for 2 minutes. Studies show it can help you move from the reactive state of no to the receptive state of yes. So that's one technique to do. Another technique, literally putting a hand on your abdomen and a hand on your chest like this, makes your brain work with your heart in your chest in a much more coordinated way, and can you bring you from this reactive state to this more receptive, open state. And then doing practices that help you integrate, which is a word we haven't used, but put different things together, can help you actually maintain an empathic and compassionate state of caring without burning out. And these techniques are available for everyone to learn. And so it's basically like a training kit that can be learned in all sorts of places, but taking that into the field, and we can talk about this on the panel, it would be an essential thing to do. So when you're aware that you're in a no-brain state of reactivity and you're going to burn out, you do these practices that allow your mental state to become receptive. There may be all sorts of things you want to change in the work of your organization. So it doesn't mean when you become receptive and accepting that you just let things go. It doesn't mean being passive. It means you get clear and calm. So the analogy I'll leave you with is these techniques allow you, if you think about stress as a way that a tablespoon of salt is being shoved into a very small container of water, like an espresso cup. What would that water taste like if the salt were put in it? Too salty to drink because the water is so small. When you teach a humanitarian aid worker or a medical physician the capacity to widen that container so it's 100 liters in size, now what happens when you take that same stressor and put it into that water? What does it taste like? It tastes like fresh water. That's the kind of tools that we can give for all workers who try to help reduce suffering in this world. That's something together we can provide for our important humanitarian aid workers. Thank you very much.